Today is Wednesday, September 24th, 2025, and this is William Michael, the headmaster of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Today I received a message from a student in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy's Aesop's Fables course, and the student asked if I would provide an explanation of Aesop's fable on the fox and the bramble. So in this talk, I'd like to do that. I'd like to lead students in a careful study of Aesop's fable. This is number 55 in our Aesop's Fable course. And the title of the fable is The Fox and the Bramble. Now, as we always do with Aesop's fables, we'll read through the fable, then we'll go through and paraphrase it, make sure we understand all the content that we find in the fable. Then we'll identify a moral lesson that Aesop teaches. We'll talk about the significance of the characters and why Aesop likely chose the characters to teach this moral lesson. And then we'll talk about how this fable applies to our lives. So let's read together Aesop's fable of the fox and the bramble. A fox, hotly pursued by the hounds, jumped through a hedge, and his feet were sadly torn by a bramble that grew in the midst. He fell to licking his paws with many a curse against the bramble for its unkind treatment. Softly, softly, good words, if you please, Master Reynard, said the bramble. I thought you knew better than to lay hold of one whose nature it is to lay hold of others. This is the fable of the fox and the bramble. So let's look at the content of this fable, because we may not be familiar with foxes or what's going on here with the hounds in this fable. What we can see is a fable that tells a story of a fox hunt. And the way that fox hunting works is that men, usually on horses, let a bunch of hounds, which are trained hunting dogs, they let them loose in the countryside. And these hounds are trained to find and track the smell of foxes. The hounds go after the foxes, and the men on the horses follow the hounds. And the goal is usually, especially in the ancient world, the goal is to kill or trap the foxes. The reason why the men would do this is because foxes are real pests in farm communities. They can do all sorts of damage, especially with chickens and eggs, small animals. They can be a real nuisance to farmers. And so the farmers would hunt the foxes, and the hounds would be used to find and track them, as I said. And this is what we read of here in this fable. A fox was being hotly pursued by the hounds. That is, they were chasing him and bearing down on him very hard. At some point in this chase, the fox came running up to a hedge, which is a bushy patch of shrubs of all different kinds, usually, and these are often along fence lines where fields are divided. So the fox was running up to the edge of a field, or maybe in the woods there was a patch of shrubs, and he decided to jump through it to try to get away from these hounds that were chasing him. So when he jumped through the hedge, through the bushes, but unfortunately inside that bunch of bushes, inside that hedge, there was a bramble. A bramble is a fruit bush, like a blackberry bush or a raspberry bush, and they were thorny. So you can imagine jumping through what looked like a soft bunch of hedges, but inside of it was a thorny, woody blackberry bush. And so when the fox jumped through the hedge, he got torn up by the thorns in this bramble. And he sort of fell down after he jumped through this hedge. It's likely that the dogs didn't make it through the hedge but were kept out. So he succeeded in getting away at that moment. But he injured his feet because they were caught in the bramble and torn up by the thorns. You can imagine, if you've ever worked on rose bushes or if you have any thorny fruit bushes, you know just how painful they can be. So the fox, after jumping through the hedge and having his feet torn up, cursed the bramble for the injuries that he suffered. But the bramble responded to the fox's curses and said, "Softly, softly, good words, if you please, Master Reynard." The bramble says, "That's not very fair to yell at me for cutting your feet when you jumped through me. That doesn't make much sense. It's not my fault." And then he says, the bramble that is, says, "I thought you knew better than to lay hold of one whose nature it is to lay hold of others." So the bramble says, don't be angry with me because you made a bad decision. I'm a bramble. I'm a thorny bush. That's what I do. That's why I exist. That's my nature. That's what I do. That's what I was created for, how I was made. So don't yell at me if you jumped through a bramble and were torn up by its thorns. That's what brambles do. And this is the end of the fable. So this is the story that Aesop tells us, a story about a fox being chased by men with their trained hounds, jumping through a hedge which happens to have inside of it hidden a thorny bramble. And then this discussion between the fox and the bramble. Now let's remember that foxes, especially in Aesop's fables, they're usually symbols of cunning. The fox is very clever, very sneaky. Foxes are beautiful animals. If you've ever seen a fox live, they're beautiful, stunningly beautiful animals. They jump and bound as they run through the fields, and when you get a good look at a fox, they're like the most beautiful dogs or cats you could ever imagine. They're really beautiful animals, and yet they're real menaces. They're real troublemakers in the country. They do all kinds of damage. So this fox, again, is being chased by these hounds, and we have this conversation. The bramble says, "I thought you were a smart guy. I thought you were clever. You're supposed to be cunning. Shouldn't you be more careful when you jump through a hedge, knowing that there could be brambles inside and that you'd get all torn up? So don't blame me for being a bramble. You should blame yourself." And I think this leads us to the moral of this fable. The moral of the fable is not to blame situations where everything in the situation is doing what it's supposed to do, and we've simply made a bad decision. So don't blame others for your bad decisions, especially when those others, whether they're things or people, are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And we can think of lots of applications of this moral. Just to be clear again, the moral that I would suggest here is to not blame others for our bad decisions. Don't blame others for our bad decisions. It's important that the bramble says, "It's just my nature to be thorny. I didn't do anything wrong. I was standing here minding my own business as a bramble. I'm covered with thorns. That's the way I was made, and you chose to come running and jump through me. The cause of your pain, Mr. Fox," which is what Master Reynard means, "the cause of your pain is your own bad decision. Don't blame me for having thorns." So the moral lesson, we can think of Bible passages that teach this same idea. We can think of a Bible passage that says, those who play with fire get burned, right? If you're messing around with sin, for example, a certain behavior is sinful, or certain people are sinful, and you choose to mess around with those people, and then what happens? You get what you deserve because they do what it is their nature to do, and you end up injured, or you lose things, or they steal from you, and you knew that going in, that they were that kind of person, and you made a bad decision, but then you blame them and you complain that this or that is their fault. And it's true to a degree that it's their fault, but you knew that it was their nature to do those things. And so it's a warning to don't think that you can blame others when you yourself make a bad decision. Now, a good passage, as I said, from Scripture, we can think of Proverbs 22. There's a proverb, verse 5, and it actually relates to thorns, which makes it especially interesting. Thorns and snares are in the way of the perverse. He who guards his soul keeps far from them. Thorns and snares are in the way of the perverse. He who guards his soul keeps far from them. In other words, the way of the perverse is the way that sinful people live, the things that sinful people do. That way is full of thorns and snares, and we all know that. A wise man stays away from the way of the perverse. He doesn't go down the way of the perverse or walk in the way of sinners, and then when he gets into trouble, think that he can blame the way of sin. He already knew the way of sin was full of thorns and jumped into it thinking that it would help him. And so he ends up getting torn up by the way of sin and then tries to blame others, but really it's his own decision. Now, if I was to think about an application, what comes to mind? I would think of a person who chooses to use drugs. Think about it. Every child growing up is taught not to use drugs. Everyone is told to stay away from dangerous things like smoking or using alcohol, all different kinds of illegal drugs. We're told about all the possible dangers, all the health problems, and most of all, we're warned that some of them can be addictive. You can actually get addicted to it and be so controlled by the desire for the drug that you can't stop. It just sort of takes over your body and mind. Really terrible. And so we find people who go down this way, who mess around with drugs or alcohol, and they end up getting addicted. And then we have this confusing situation where we look at a person and we look at how their life has been torn up like the fox's feet, just torn up, and how this person is suffering because of this addiction to drugs. And yet, when we think about it, we have to say, don't blame the drugs. You knew that the drugs threatened to harm you, and you ran into them anyway. And what did they do? They did nothing but what it's their nature to do. And so here you are, a person addicted to drugs. And what we tend to do, especially in modern society where we're always trying to blame other things for our bad choices, is that we blame the drugs as if they did something wrong, when the truth is that we made the choice to use the drugs. Even if there's addiction, if a person is addicted, we could say, oh, poor guy, he's addicted. It's not his fault, he's addicted. But what Aristotle taught is that it's true that once a person is addicted, they now have a very difficult time getting out of that addiction. But that person is responsible for the first times that he freely chose to use those drugs because he's the one who put himself in danger of the addiction. And so he can't blame the addiction. He can't blame the drugs. They're just doing what they do. I thought you knew better than to lay hold of one whose nature it is to lay hold of others. You can see how that really describes the experience of a person who gets addicted to dangerous drugs. You knew better and chose to get wrapped up with the drug anyway, and now here you are, all torn up by it and injured. And it's your own fault because you chose to lay hold of one whose nature it is to lay hold of others. So I think a good application of the moral lesson of this fable would be a person who messes around with drugs, like playing with fire, and the drugs end up having the effect on him that he was told they could, and he then ends up with all kinds of problems in his life, physical problems, health problems, and he looks around as if to blame others, or others around him look around to blame others. But the truth is, if you mess around with the thorn bushes, you're going to get torn up. And I think that's the moral lesson of this fable. Now remember, when we study Aesop's fables, there's not just one lesson. You can think of this in a number of different ways, and it's fun actually to think of the fable in a number of different ways. For example, we can think of the lesson through the eyes or through the experience of the fox and ask, what do you think the moral lesson is for the fox? But then we can also think of the moral lesson, let's say, of the hound dogs, or of the bramble, or of the hedge, or of the hunters. We can think about the fable from different perspectives, and sometimes we see different moral lessons. So when I say, here is a moral lesson in this fable, I don't want you to think that's the only moral lesson, or that's even what Aesop intended when he taught this fable. I'd like you to study the fables and think about them for yourselves. Sometimes students can come up with really interesting moral lessons as they think about the fables and just see different things. Think about different Bible passages, think about other stories you've read. Sometimes you can see similarities between those Bible passages or stories or even movies in the fables as we read them. So that, I hope, is a helpful walk through Aesop's fable of the fox and the bramble. I hope you understand the meaning of all the different parts of the fable, the characters, the different things we meet, everything that's said in the fable. I hope you can at least get an idea of one moral lesson that we can draw from this fable. But I'd like to challenge you to think about it. Think about an application. Think about an application that's unique in your life. How does this moral lesson apply to your life? Where can you think of an example of something you did where you learned a similar lesson the hard way? Or think about a situation where it might happen in the future, something that you can watch out for. But meditate on Aesop's fable of the fox and the bramble, and I look forward to seeing your assignment when you get done. I hope that's helpful. God bless.